Professor Zyx'nax took a deep breath, steadying her tentacles as Axa prepared to face yet another day of educating the most eclectic, and if Ix was being honest, downright terrifying group of students in the known galaxy. She glanced at the holo display, confirming that yes, it was indeed time for Xenobiology 101 at the Galactic Federation University. May the cosmic forces grant me patience, Zyx'nax muttered, a habit Ix had picked up from spending far too much time around the humans. Speaking of which, as the professor glided into the lecture hall, Sir Compound Eyes immediately zeroed in on the source of Ix's daily migraines, the human exchange student Sarah Johnson. The Deathworlder sat in the front row, grinning from ear to ear, a terrifying expression that still made Zyx'nax's exoskeleton crawl. Next to her study partner, Zyx'nax's tentacles curled in reflexive horror. Beside Sarah lounged a massive scaled creature with rows of razor-sharp teeth and claws that could shred durasteel like tissue paper. The Zyx'ka, a top predator from a Category 9 Deathworld, was supposedly Sarah's pet. The university had nearly imploded when Sarah insisted on bringing Fluffy to class, citing some obscure Earth regulation about emotional support animals. "Good morning, class," Zyx'nax began, trying to ignore the way Fluffy's forked tongue flicked out to taste the air. "Today we'll be discussing—" "OMG, Prof," said Sarah's voice cut through the air like a plasma cutter through butter. "You won't believe what happened last night during our study session." Zyx'nax suppressed a sigh. "Ms. Johnson, perhaps we could save personal anecdotes for after the lecture." Sarah laughed, a sound that made half the class instinctively activate their defensive mechanisms. "But Prof, it's totally relevant. We were studying Chapter 7, about predator-prey relationships." The Zyx'ka Fluffy let out a rumbling sound that might have been a purr or a growl. It was hard to tell with apex predators. "Go on," Zyx'nax said warily, sensing that resistance was futile. Sarah's grin widened, if that was even possible. "Well, Fluffy and I were going over the material and I realized, hey, we're like the perfect case study. So we decided to do a little practical experiment." The entire class collectively held their breath, or equivalent gas exchange processes. "We went to the holo sim room and set up a mock hunting scenario," Sarah continued, oblivious to the growing horror around her. "Fluffy was the predator, obviously, and I was the prey. It was awesome. We learned so much about stalking techniques, evasion strategies, and the adrenaline rush of a good chase." Zyx'nax felt Ixer chromatophores shifting to a sickly shade of green. "Ms. Johnson, are you telling me that you willingly allowed a Zyx'ka to hunt you for educational purposes?" Sarah nodded enthusiastically. "Yep, Fluffy's an amazing teacher. Did you know they have a secondary set of retractable claws? I didn't until I felt them grazing my back during one of our captures." Talk about hands-on learning. A Gleipnir student in the back row fainted, its gelatinous body puddling onto the floor with a soft plop. That's Zyx'nax struggled to find words in any of the 17 languages X was fluent in. "Brilliant, right?" Sarah finished for Zim. "I was thinking we could do a presentation for the class, maybe a live demonstration." The mere thought sent Zyx'nax's fight-or-flight response into overdrive. "Absolutely not," X squeaked, tentacles flailing. "Ms. Johnson, while your enthusiasm for the subject matter is commendable, I must insist that you refrain from any further practical experiments involving life-threatening situations." Sarah's face fell, and Fluffy let out a disappointed rumble. "Aw, come on, Prof Z, where's your sense of adventure? Your scientific curiosity? I left it at home, along with my will to live," Zyx'nax muttered under her breath. "What was that?" Sarah asked, tilting her head. Nothing, Zyx'nax said quickly. "Let's just move on to today's lesson, shall we? And please, Ms. Johnson, try to keep your interspecies bonding activities to a minimum during class time." Sarah shrugged, reaching over to scratch Fluffy behind what passed for ears on the massive predator. "Fine, but you're missing out on some grade A educational content, right, Fluffles?" The Zyx'ka's response was to open its maw wide enough to swallow a small shuttlecraft, revealing row upon row of gleaming teeth. Several students scrambled for the exit. Zyx'nax sighed heavily. It was going to be another long day at Galactic Federation University. As the weeks passed, Zyx'nax found herself in an increasingly surreal educational landscape. The presence of Sarah and her emotional support apex predator had turned Xenobiology 101 into a daily exercise in chaos management and existential dread. Today's lesson on interspecies communication was no exception. "All right, class," Zyx'nax began, trying to ignore the way Fluffy was eyeing the holographic display like it was a particularly juicy snack. "We'll be discussing the various methods different species use to convey information, from chemical signals to bioluminescence to—" "Ooh, oh," Sarah's hand shot up so fast it nearly took out the eye stalks of the poor Zarthian sitting behind her. "Don't forget interpretive dance." Zyx'nax blinked all four of her eyes in rapid succession. "I don't believe interpretive dance is a recognized form of interspecies communication, Ms. Johnson." Sarah's grin took on a manic edge that made Zyx'nax's exoskeleton itch. "Not yet, it isn't. But Fluffy and I have been working on a routine that I think will revolutionize the field. Want to see?" Before Zyx'nax could formulate a response or initiate an emergency lockdown of the lecture hall, Sarah had leapt to her feet. Fluffy, with a grace that belied its massive size, uncoiled from its lounging position and slumped to the front of the room. "Hit it, Fluffles," Sarah called out, striking a pose that looked alarmingly like a fighting stance. The Zyx'nax let out an ear-splitting roar that caused several of the more sensitive-eared species in the class to curl up into defensive balls. Then, to Zyx'nax's utter disbelief, the deadly predator began to undulate. Sarah, meanwhile, had launched into a series of movements that seemed to defy the laws of physics and common sense. She leapt, spun, and contorted her body in ways that made Zyx'nax wonder if humans had some kind of internal hydraulic system. You see, Sarah panted between increasingly elaborate maneuvers. The key to interspecies understanding is finding a common language, and what's more universal than the language of dance. Fluffy punctuated this statement with a graceful swipe of its claws that came within millimeters of decapitating the front row of students. They didn't even flinch at this point. Near-death experiences had become a daily occurrence in Xenobiology 101. Ms. Johnson, Zyx'nax said weakly, "While I appreciate your creative approach, I'm not sure how this relates to our curriculum." Sarah executed a backflip that brought her perilously close to Fluffy's snapping jaws. "It's all about nonverbal cues, Prof. Z. Look at how Fluffy's tail swish communicates curiosity, while the angle of their head spines shows attentiveness. And my movements? They're a human interpretation of Zyx'nax hunting patterns." As if to demonstrate, Sarah dropped into a crouch and began stalking across the room on all fours, mimicking Fluffy's predatory gait with unsettling accuracy. The Zyx'nax, apparently delighted by this display, let out a series of chirps and clicks that sounded disturbingly like laughter. "Fascinating," drawled a Valaxian student from the back of the room, its bioluminescent spots flashing in what might have been sarcasm. "And how, pray tell, does one distinguish this dance from an actual hunt?" Sarah paused mid-prowl, her face lighting up. "Excellent question. Fluffy, want to demonstrate the difference." Before Zyx'nax could intervene, the lecture hall erupted into chaos. Fluffy, taking Sarah's words as permission, launched into full predator mode. Students scattered in all directions as the massive creature bounded across desks and chairs, playfully snapping at anyone who got too close. Sarah, for her part, seemed to be having the time of her life. She vaulted over Fluffy's back, using the Zyx'nax's armored plates as a springboard to reach the upper levels of the lecture hall. "See," she called out to the panicking class, "in a real hunt, there'd be way more screaming and running for your lives." "There's plenty of screaming happening right now," Zyx'nax shouted, trying to corral the more vulnerable students behind their desk. "Exactly," Sarah beamed, somehow managing to look triumphant while dangling upside down from a light fixture. "Isn't hands-on learning the best?" As Fluffy cornered a group of trembling glipnors, their gelatinous bodies quivering in terror, Zyx'nax made a mental note to update Ixer curriculum vitae. Surely there had to be teaching positions available on nice, quiet, predator-free planets. "All right, Fluffles, that's enough for now," Sarah called out, somersaulting down from her perch. The Zyx'nax immediately ceased its play hunt, padding back to Sarah's side with a satisfied rumble. The class slowly emerged from their various hiding spots, eyeing the human-predator duo with a mixture of fear, awe, and most worryingly to Zyx'nax's growing curiosity. So Sarah said, not even slightly out of breath, "Any questions about interspecies communication?" To Zyx'nax's horror, several tentacles, appendages, and pseudopods raised into the air. It was going to be a long semester. As the academic year progressed, Zyx'nax found itself caught in a whirlwind of increasingly bizarre educational experiences courtesy of Sarah Kizday, Fluffy. The human's unorthodox approach to xenobiology had, against all odds and several university regulations, begun to yield some interesting results. Take, for example, the day Sarah decided to tackle the subject of alien cuisine. "All right, class," Zyx'nax began, trying to maintain some semblance of academic decorum. "Today we'll be discussing the various nutritional requirements of different species and how they've shaped culinary traditions across the galaxy." Sarah's hand shot up so fast it generated a small sonic boom. "Ooh, Prof. Z, can we do a taste test? I brought samples." Zyx'nax felt a sense of dread settling into all three of their stomachs. "Ms. Johnson, I'm not sure that's advisable. Many species have very specific dietary needs and restrictions." But Sarah was already rummaging through a comically oversized backpack. "Don't worry, I did my research. I've got something for everyone." Even Fluffy helped out. The Zyx'nax, curled up in its usual spot beside Sarah, lifted its massive head at the mention of its name. Was that anticipation in its multifaceted eyes? "Now for our silicon-based friend," Sarah announced, pulling out a tray of what looked suspiciously like pebbles. "I've got a selection of rare earth minerals, lightly toasted for that extra crunch." A Lithosian student in the back perked up, its crystalline structure vibrating with interest. "For our methane breathers," Sarah continued, producing a sealed container that emitted an ominous hiss when opened. A delightful gaseous concoction that Fluffy and I whipped up in the chemistry lab. "I don't ask about the explosion, I mean." Unexpected exothermic reaction. Zyx'nax made a mental note to have a stern talk with the head of the chemistry department. "And for our liquid-based lifeforms," Sarah grinned, brandishing a series of vials filled with suspiciously glowing liquids. a variety of nutrient-rich solutions. The blue one's my personal favorite. It tastes like liquid starlight with a hint of supernova. A Glipner student extended a gelatinous pseudopod towards the vials, only to have it hastily retracted by its more sensible lab partner. Ms. Zyx'nax interjected, feeling chromatophores shifting to a nervous puce. While your enthusiasm is commendable, I must insist that we stick to theoretical discussions of xenogastronomy, the liability issues alone. Oh, come on, Prof. Z. Sarah pouted, an expression that made her look disturbingly like Fluffy eyeing his prey. Where's your sense of culinary adventure? Besides, I've saved the best for last. With a flourish that would have made a magician jealous, Sarah produced a covered platter. For our carnivorous classmates, a special treat prepared by none other than Fluffy himself. The Zyx'nax let out a rumbling purr that sounded suspiciously like pride. Now, I know what you're thinking, Sarah said, her grin wide enough to make a Cheshire cat jealous. How did a top predator from a Category 9 Deathworld learn to cook? Well, it all started when I introduced Fluffy to the Food Network. Zyx'nax felt a headache building in all 7 of her brain nodes. Ms. Johnson, I really don't think. But it was too late. Sarah had already whipped off the cover with a theatrical ta-da, revealing. Well, Zyx'nax wasn't entirely sure what X was looking at. It appeared to be some kind of meat, arranged in an intricate pattern that might have been artistic if it wasn't so terrifying. Bits of bone and what looked suspiciously like still wriggling tentacles adorned the dish like macabre garnishes. Fluffy calls it prey surprise, Sarah announced proudly. It's a fusion cuisine, blending traditional Zyx'nax hunting techniques with Earth's molecular gastronomy. The sauce is to die for literally, if you're not careful with the neurotoxins. The class stared in stunned silence, a mixture of horror and morbid fascination on their various alien faces. Anyone want to try? Sarah asked, brandishing a fork that looked more like a small trident. To Zyx'nax's utter disbelief, a Wechsler student in the front row tentatively raised a clawed appendage. I'll give it a go, it chittered nervously. That's the spirit, Sarah beamed, depositing a generous portion onto the Wechsler's desk. Just remember to chew thoroughly. Some bits might still be, active. As the brave or foolhardy Wechsler took its first cautious bite, Zyx'nax found herself wondering if it was too late to change careers. Perhaps deep space exploration. Surely facing the unknown horrors of the universe couldn't be more stressful than this. Oh wow, the Wechsler exclaimed, its mandibles working overtime. It's indescribable. That's what we were going for, Sarah said enthusiastically. Fluffy believes that true culinary art should transcend mere words, right, buddy? The Zyx'nax let out a rumble that could have been agreement or indigestion. It was hard to tell with apex predators turned amateur chefs. You see, Professor Z. Sarah continued, oblivious to the growing chaos around her. This is what xenobiology is all about. Breaking down barriers, challenging preconceptions, and expanding our culinary horizons across the galaxy. Zyx'nax watched in mute horror as more students, emboldened by the Wechsler's survival, began to sample Fluffy's creation. The lecture hall filled with a cacophony of slurps, crunches, and the occasional muffled scream. Ms. Zyx'nax finally managed, her voice barely above a whisper. While I appreciate your innovative approach to cross-species understanding, I must insist that we return to the approved curriculum. Perhaps we could discuss the evolutionary adaptations that led to these diverse dietary needs. Sarah's face lit up like a supernova. Oh, great idea, Prof. Z, and I know just how to demonstrate. Fluffy, want to show the class your retractable stomach? Before Zyx'nax could protest, the massive Zyx'nax had rolled onto its back, exposing its armored underbelly. With a sound like a trash compactor trying to digest a spaceship, Fluffy's abdominal plates began to shift and separate. Now pay attention, everyone, Sarah said, adopting a scholarly tone that was somewhat undercut by her manic grin. The Zyx'nax evolved on a planet with extremely unpredictable food sources. To adapt, they developed the ability to externalize their digestive system, allowing them to consume prey much larger than themselves. As if on cue, Fluffy's stomach opened like some nightmarish flower, revealing a complex array of organs, acid sacs, and what looked disturbingly like a built-in blender. Isn't it beautiful? Sarah sighed, gazing at the horrific display with the fondness most people reserved for sunsets or cute puppies. Now who wants to see it in action? I've got a volunteer right here. To Zyx'nax's alarm, Sarah produced a hovered drone from her seemingly bottomless backpack. The drone, painted to resemble a generic prey animal, buzzed nervously. Ms. Zyx'nax said weakly, I really must insist, but it was too late. Sarah had already launched the drone, which zoomed around the lecture hall in a panic. Fluffy's eyes tracked its movement with predatory focus. And here we see the hunting instincts in action, Sarah narrated enthusiastically. Notice the way Fluffy's ocular ridges flattened to reduce air resistance. The slight twitch in the tail indicates imminent pounce. And in 3, 2, 1. With a speed that defied its massive size, Fluffy leapt. The unfortunate drone never stood a chance. In one fluid motion, the Zyx'nax snatched the drone mid-air and deposited it into its gaping stomach maw. The class watched in fascinated horror as Fluffy's abdominal plates sealed shut, accompanied by ominous grinding noises from within. Magnificent, Sarah cheered, applauding wildly. Now, let's talk about the various acids and enzymes at work in this digestive process. Can anyone guess the pH level of Fluffy's primary stomach? To Zyx'nax's utter disbelief, several students raised their hands or equivalent appendages to answer. The lecture had devolved into a bizarre mix of extreme nature documentary and cooking show, with a dash of mad science thrown in for good measure. As Sarah launched into a detailed explanation of Zyx'nax's digestive biochemistry, complete with holographic diagrams and the occasional burp from Fluffy, Zyx'nax found herself wondering how X had ended up here. C had joined the Galactic Federation University faculty with dreams of shaping young minds and advancing the field of xenobiology. Instead, X was watching a human and her pet apex predator rewrite the curriculum through sheer chaotic enthusiasm. The worst part, despite the madness, or perhaps because of it, the students seemed more engaged than ever. Even the Glipnor, who had fainted earlier, was now taking furious notes, its gelatinous body quivering with excitement rather than fear. Zyx'nax sighed, resigning herself to the new normal. If you can't beat them, join them, as the humans say. Besides, X had to admit, in a terrified sort of way, that this was the most interesting Xenobiology 101 had ever been. All right, Ms. Johnson, Zyx'nax said, straightening the posture and summoning what remained of professorial dignity. Perhaps you'd like to lead us in a discussion on the ethical implications of interspecies predator-prey relationships in an academic setting. Sarah's grin, if possible, grew even wider. Oh, Prof. Z, I thought you'd never ask. Fluffy and I have been working on a presentation about that very topic. It involves role play, interpretive dance, and a small thermonuclear device. For demonstrative purposes only, of course. As the class erupted into excited chatter and Fluffy began clearing space for what promised to be an unforgettable presentation, Zyx'nax made a mental note to update her will. Teaching might not be hazardous duty on most planets, but then again, most planets didn't have Sarah Johnson and her emotional support apex predator. Welcome to Xenobiology 101, where the curriculum is made up and the safety protocols don't matter. Class dismissed if you dare. Months passed, and against all odds and several strongly worded letters from the university's legal department, Sarah, Fluffy, and the rest of the Xenobiology 101 class had made it to the end of the semester. It was time for final projects, and Zyx'nax found herself both dreading and, grudgingly, looking forward to what Sarah and her predatory partner would come up with. The day of presentations arrived, and the lecture hall buzzed with nervous energy. Students from across the galaxy fidgeted in their seats, tentacles twitched, and bioluminescent displays flickered with anxiety. At the front of the room, Zyx'nax tried to project an aura of calm authority. Despite the fact that Ixie had taken the precaution of wearing 3 different types of protective gear under zero academic robes. All right, class, Zyx'nax began. Today we'll be presenting our final projects on interspecies cooperation and understanding. Who would like to go first? Before the words had fully left Ixer mouth parts, a familiar voice rang out. Ooh, oh, we would Prof. C. Zyx'nax suppressed a sigh. Of course. Very well, Ms. Johnson. The floor is yours. And please try to keep property damage to a minimum this time. Sarah bounded to the front of the room, Fluffy slinking behind her with predatory grace. The human's grin was wide enough to make a black hole feel inadequate, while the Zyx'nax's expression was, well, still terrifying, but perhaps a touch less murderous than usual. Fellow xenobiologists, esteemed Professor Zyx'nax, honored classmate Sarah began, her voice carrying the gravitas of a general about to lead troops into glorious battle. Today, Fluffy and I are proud to present our groundbreaking research on extreme bonding, forging interspecies connections through shared mortal peril. A nervous titter ran through the class. Zyx'nax felt Ixer chromatophores shifting to a concerned mauve. Now I know what you're thinking, Sarah continued, pacing back and forth with the energy of a caffeinated hummingbird. Mortal peril. In an academic setting, how delightfully unorthodox. But hear me out. Through a series of carefully controlled near-death experiences, Fluffy and I have discovered that nothing brings species together quite like the imminent threat of gruesome demise. Fluffy chose that moment to yawn, showcasing several rows of teeth that could have doubled as steak knives. Several students instinctively activated their defensive mechanisms. Let's start with our methodology, Sarah said, pulling out a holographic projector. We began with simple trust falls, me falling from increasingly ridiculous heights, trusting Fluffy to catch me before I became a human pancake. Did you know that Zyx'nax have reflexes fast enough to snatch a mosquito out of the air? I do now. The hologram displayed a series of images showing Sarah plummeting from various precarious perches, with Fluffy leaping to make last-second catches. Zyx'nax made a mental note to have a serious talk with the campus safety committee. But that was just the warm-up, Sarah continued, her eyes gleaming with the kind of manic enthusiasm usually reserved for doomsday cult leaders. We quickly moved on to more advanced bonding exercises. Maze running with electrified walls, underwater escape rooms, and my personal favorite zero-gravity knife juggling. As Sarah rhapsodized about the finer points of dodging monomolecular blades in free fall, Zyx'nax couldn't help but notice something odd. The rest of the class, rather than cowering in terror as they had at the beginning of the semester, were taking notes. A Valaxian in the front row was even recording the presentation, its bioluminescent spots pulsing with what looked suspiciously like excitement. But the real breakthrough came when we introduced other species into our experiment, Sarah said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. Volunteers, could you please stand up? To Zyx'nax's utter disbelief, nearly half the class rose to their feet or equivalent appendages. Each student bore the proud, slightly singed look of someone who had stared death in the face and lived to tell the tale. These brave souls joined Fluffy and me for what we like to call extreme xenobiology Olympics, Umrah announced. Events included synchronized swimming in a pool of highly corrosive acid, a three-legged race through a minefield, and the ever-popular pin the tail on the angry Zyx'nax. Fluffy let out a rumbling purr that might have been nostalgia, or possibly indigestion from eating one too many tail pins. The results were astounding, Sarah continued, bringing up a series of charts and graphs that looked like the love child of a scientific journal and an action movie poster. We saw a 500% increase in interspecies empathy, a 300% improvement in cross-cultural communication, and a 1000% boost in adrenaline production across all participating species. Zyx'nax squinted at the data, her scientific curiosity warring with her sense of self-preservation. Ms. Johnson, while your methods are unorthodox, to say the least, I must admit the results are intriguing. However, I'm concerned about the ethical implications. Excellent point, Prof said. Sarah beamed. That's why we've prepared a live demonstration. Fluffy, if you would. Before Zyx'nax could protest, the massive Zyx'nax had bounded to the center of the room. With a grace that belied its size, Fluffy began dancing. No, not quite dancing. The predator was moving through a series of fluid motions that looked almost ritualistic. What you're seeing is a traditional Zyx'nax bonding ceremony, Sarah explained, her voice taking on a reverential tone. Historically used to forge alliances between rival hunting packs, it's a display of trust, skill, and controlled aggression. And now, thanks to our research, it's been adapted for interspecies participation. With that, Sarah launched herself into the fray. Human and Zyx'nax moved in perfect sync. A whirlwind of limbs, claws, and what looked disturbingly like battle axes. Where had those come from? It was beautiful, terrifying, and utterly mesmerizing. Now Sarah called out, somehow managing to speak clearly while dodging Fluffy's playful swipes. Who wants to join us? To Zyx'nax's amazement and horror, students began to rise from their seats. The Valaxian practically leapt onto the impromptu dance floor, its bioluminescent displays creating a dazzling light show. A group of Glipners oozed together to form a gelatinous conga line. Even the typically reserved Lithosian rolled into the center, its crystalline structure catching the light in a prismatic display. Before Eggs knew it, Zyx'nax found herself swept up in the chaos. One moment X was standing at the podium. The next X was in the middle of what could only be described as a xenobiological rave. Tentacles, pseudopods, and limbs of all descriptions moved in a rhythm that should have been impossible given the diversity of species present. And at the center of it all, Sarah and Fluffy led the dance, their movements a perfect blend of human adaptability and Zyx'nax predatory grace. It was beautiful, terrifying, and utterly, gloriously insane. As X twirled and dodged narrowly, avoiding being stepped on by an enthusiastic Thraxian, Zyx'nax had an epiphany. This, right here, was the true spirit of xenobiology. Not sterile labs and dry textbooks, but the messy, chaotic, sometimes dangerous process of species coming together, learning from each other, and yes, occasionally risking life and limb in the name of understanding. The dance reached a crescendo, with Sarah perched atop Fluffy's back, both of them roaring, or in Sarah's case, whooping in triumph. The rest of the class, caught up in the moment, added their own vocalizations to the chorus. The resulting sound was like nothing Zyx'nax had ever heard before, a symphony of interstellar harmony and chaos. As the impromptu performance came to an end, the class erupted into applause, tentacle waves, and various species-specific expressions of approval. Sarah dismounted from her predatory partner with a gymnast's flourish, bowing deeply. And that, ladies, gentlemen, and beings of indeterminate or fluctuating gender, she announced, slightly out of breath but grinning from ear to ear, is the true power of extreme xenobiology. Zyx'nax found herself clapping along with the rest of the class, her earlier reservations swept away by the sheer audacity and effectiveness of Sarah's approach. Ms. Johnson, she said, trying to inject some professorial gravitas into her voice. Difficult, given that one of her tentacles was still tapping out the rhythm of the dance, I must say. Your presentation was unprecedented. Sarah's grin, if possible, grew even wider. Thanks, Prof. Z. Does this mean we pass? Zyx'nax looked around the lecture hall. The students were chattering excitedly. Species that would never have interacted at the beginning of the semester now engaged in animated discussion. The air buzzed with an energy that had nothing to do with the residual static from the Valaxians' light show. Paz Zyx'nax found herself chuckling, a sound that startled several nearby students. Ms. Johnson, I dare say you've just revolutionized the field of xenobiology. Your methods may be unorthodox, possibly illegal, and definitely hazardous to one's health, But the results speak for themselves. Sarah pumped her fist in the air, letting out a whoop of joy. Fluffy, picking up on its human's excitement, let out a roar that shook the windows. As the class devolved into a mix of scientific debate and impromptu interspecies dance-off, Zyx'nax reflected on the journey of the past semester. When Sarah and Fluffy had first arrived, Yggsy had been certain they would be the death of Zer either literally or professionally. Instead, they had breathed new life into a field X had feared was growing stagnant. Yes, there had been property damage. Yes, the university's insurance premiums would probably skyrocket. And yes, X would likely be fielding concerned calls from the Galactic Ethics Committee for years to come. But looking at the vibrant, diverse group of students before XIM, all boundaries of species and culture temporarily erased in the joy of shared discovery, Zyx'nax knew it had been worth it. This, Z realized, was the future of xenobiology. Messy, chaotic, occasionally terrifying, but always exciting. And it had taken a human and her emotional support apex predator to show them the way. As Sarah launched into an impromptu lecture on the finer points of Zyx'nax interpretive dance with Fluffy providing live demonstrations, Zyx'nax settled back to watch. C had a feeling that this was just the beginning of a new era in xenobiology, one that would be talked about in academic circles for cycles to come. The remainder of the class time flew by in a whirlwind of interspecies mingling, impromptu dance-offs, and heated debates about the ethical implications of using near-death experiences as teaching tools. As the students filed out of the lecture hall, many of them exchanging contact information and making plans for future study sessions, Zyx'nax approached Sarah and Fluffy. Ms. Johnson next began, trying to maintain a semblance of professorial dignity, despite the fact that one of Zer tentacles was still tapping out the rhythm of the Zyx'nax war dance. I must say, when you first joined this class with your unique study partner, I had my doubts. Sarah grinned, absently scratching Fluffy behind what passed for ears on the massive predator. Aw, come on, Prof Z admitted we grew on you. Like a particularly aggressive form of space fungus. Zyx'nax's chromatophores shifted through a range of colors before settling on a warm, amused pink. An apt analogy, considering the rate at which you've spread your particular brand of chaos throughout the university. I've had calls from the astrophysics department asking if you'd be interested in testing the effects of black hole event horizons on interspecies cooperation. Ooh, that sounds fun. Sarah's eyes lit up with the kind of manic glee that Zyx'nax had come to both dread and secretly admire. What do you think, Fluffles? Up for a little space-time continuum surfing. Fluffy let out a rumbling purr that could have been enthusiasm or indigestion. It was still hard to tell, even after a full semester. Perhaps we should save the astrophysics for next semester, Zyx'nax said hastily, having vivid mental images of Sarah trying to bond with a black hole. For now, I wanted to discuss your future in the field of xenobiology. Sarah tilted her head, an expression of genuine curiosity replacing her usual grin. Oh, I figured after all the explosions, accidental dimensional rifts, and that incident with the sentient slime mold in the cafeteria, you'd be glad to see the back of us. Zyx'nax waved a tentacle dismissively. My dear, in all my cycles of teaching, I've never seen a student with your unique approach to interspecies relations. You've single-handedly revolutionized our understanding of xenobiology, not to mention stress testing every safety protocol in the university. Aw, thanks, Prof Z. Sarah beamed. So does this mean we pass the class? Zyx'nax let out a trilling laugh. Ms. Johnson, the university board is considering creating an entirely new degree program based on your methods. Extreme xenobiology, forging interstellar bonds through controlled chaos, I believe they're calling it. Sarah's jaw dropped, a rare moment of speechlessness for the usually verbose human. Even Fluffy looked impressed, its multifaceted eyes blinking in what might have been surprise. You're kidding, Sarah finally managed. I assure you I am not, Zyx'nax said, allowing a note of pride to creep into her voice. Your unorthodox methods have produced results that cannot be ignored. Species that have been at odds for generations are now coming together, united by the shared experience of your, what did you call it? Extreme Xenobiology Olympics. Sarah nodded, still looking stunned. Yeah, but I never thought. I mean, we were just having fun, pushing boundaries, seeing what would happen if we threw all the rules out the airlock. And in doing so, you've shown us a new way forward, Zyx'nax said, a way that embraces the chaos and unpredictability of interspecies relations, rather than trying to fit everything into neat, sterile categories. It's messy, it's dangerous, and it's exactly what the field of xenobiology needs. Fluffy chose that moment to let out a thunderous belch, a small plume of flame escaping its jaws. A nearby potted plant, a remnant of Sarah's brief foray into xenobotany, burst into vibrant bloom. See, even the flora responds to your unique approach, Zyx'nax chuckled. Now, about this new program. The board is hoping you'll consider staying on as a guest lecturer. Your first-hand experience with cross-species bonding would be invaluable. Sarah's eyes widened, her grin returning full force. Are you serious, me? A lecturer? Oh man, this is going to be awesome. I've got so many ideas. We could do zero-G trust falls, underwater debate clubs, extreme sports as a metaphor for diplomatic negotiations, she trailed off, lost in a whirlwind of increasingly chaotic plans. Zyx'nax felt a momentary pang of concern for the future of the university and possibly the galaxy at large, but pushed it aside. After all, if there was one thing X had learned this semester, it was that sometimes the best way forward was to embrace the chaos. "I look forward to seeing your curriculum proposals," X said, making a mental note to warn the insurance department. "Just perhaps we could start with something a little less extreme. Baby steps, as you humans say." Sarah laughed, a sound that no longer sent nearby students diving for cover. "Don't worry, Prof. Z will ease them into it. Right, Fluffy?" The Zyx'nax responded by affectionately headbutting Sarah, nearly knocking her off her feet. It was a gesture that would have terrified Zyx'nax at the beginning of the semester. Now, X found it oddly endearing. As Sarah and Fluffy bounded off, already deep in discussion about potential team-building exercises involving lava flows and anti-gravity chambers, Zyx'nax shook her head in fond exasperation. The future of xenobiology was going to be interesting, to say the least. Turning back to her desk, Zyx'nax began to compose a memo to the faculty. Subject line: "Preparing for the Sarah Johnson Era, a guide to chaos-proof classrooms and interspecies first aid." It was going to be a long night, but for the first time in cycles, Zyx'nax found herself genuinely excited about the future of her field. Who knew that all it would take to revolutionize xenobiology was one crazy human and her emotional support apex predator? As X settled in to write, Zyx'nax couldn't help but chuckle. Somewhere out there in the vast, chaotic universe, X suspected the cosmic forces were laughing too. And thanks to Sarah and Fluffy, for once, xenobiologists were in on the joke.